Hi, everyone. Nice to see you again. We previously were talking about the fact that people, us, are in the infrared, basically all pitch black. We are really good absorbers in the infrared, so that we can also be really good emitters in the infrared. That's helpful for cooling us off with radiation, radiative cooling. But today I want to go back to the question of not in the infrared, but in the visible. Why do we have skin tone? We previously saw that if I look at the reflectivity of different people, that in fact lighter skinned people will reflect more light in the visible than dark skinned people. But of course that doesn't really answer the question of why. That's just a quantitative restatement of the problem. So we could ask maybe an easier question, which is, well, what causes there to be different skin tone? And as I'm sure you're all familiar, we have this pigment called melanin. Turns out that there are two types of melanin. There's eumelanin, which is dark brown or black color, and there's pheomelanin, which is a red to yellow color. And it does it is the case that someone with a dark complexion will tend to mostly produce eumelanin, and someone with a light complexion will mostly produce pheomelanin. But at least from what I've been able to read, our skin color is mostly determined not by the type of melanin, but in fact by the number and size of melanin particles. So if you have darker skin, that just means that you are producing more melanin. And in fact, the melanin is produced by melanocytes, which are near the surface of the skin. And that production is stimulated by ultraviolet radiation. And in fact, that's why we get a tan when we go out in the sun, because it's stimulating the production of more melanin, and then that darkens the skin. So we'd like to understand a little bit more about the ultraviolet. And as I've been saying all along, anytime I have a hot object, for example, like the sun, it will emit thermal radiation. This is the spectrum. The colored region here is the spectrum of the light that we receive from the sun here on Earth. And obviously it has some light in the ultraviolet. And so we can now ask the question, well, is that ultraviolet radiation from the sun, is that good or bad for us? And the answer is a resounding yes. In fact, it is both good and bad for us. So it's bad for the reasons I'm sure you're aware of, which is that ultraviolet UV radiation can cause cancer, particularly skin cancer or melanoma. It also breaks down folates, which are substances that are derived from B vitamins. And if you don't have those, then you suffer from anemia, or you can suffer from anemia or birth defects or male infertility and a host of other complications that you don't want. So you might say, well, okay, clearly ultraviolet radiation is bad, so let's just get rid of it. We don't want any ultraviolet radiation from the sun. But that would also be a mistake, because in fact, we need ultraviolet radiation from the sun. We need that in order to stimulate our production of vitamin D. And vitamin D is very important for us. It's what enables our intestines to be able to absorb calcium and phosphorus from the food we eat, and that goes to make our bones stronger, to promote bone growth and repair. And in fact, if you have a deficiency of vitamin D, then you can get rickets if you are young, or osteoporosis if you're old. Calcium also plays a role in many health functionings of our bodies, and in fact, it's now suspected that vitamin D may help prevent certain cancers or infections. Okay, so ultraviolet radiation can be good or bad. And we can ask, well, where is the ultraviolet radiation on the planet? So we get it from the sun. It's more or less coming uniformly onto the planet, but because it has to go through different amounts of atmosphere, depending on where you are on the planet, the amount of UV that's received is less, or is different. So if we're right at the equator, then the thickness of the atmosphere you have to go through, that the sunlight would have to go through, is as thin as it can be. And as you go further north or further south of the equator, then you have to go through more of the atmosphere, and that removes more of the ultraviolet radiation. So this is a calculation just saying that the ultraviolet radiation is being lost as it goes through thicker atmosphere. Now, it turns out that's a little too simple of a model. You also need to take into account how much ozone there is, whether there's cloud cover, how much water moisture there is in the air. So this is a slightly more complicated model that tries to take into account those other effects. But it's more or less quantitatively the same. And this is now a measurement of the ultraviolet light on the planet. We see that at the equator, in fact, it is maximum, and as we go either north or south of that in latitude, then the ultraviolet radiation, the intensity drops off. Okay, remember we started this whole discussion talking about melanin. So what does this have to do with ultraviolet? Well, it turns out that melanin is a very good absorber of ultraviolet radiation. It has a peak in its absorption spectrum right in the ultraviolet. And so if you live in a climate that has very high ultraviolet intensity where that's dangerous, then you want to have more melanin in order to protect you from that UV radiation. On the other hand, if you're in a climate where there's not enough UV radiation and you're in danger of vitamin D deficiency, then you would like to have less melanin so that you can optimize the amount of vitamin D that you produce. So this is the same plot I just showed with the ultraviolet radiation as a function of latitude on the planet. And I'm now going to overlay that with measurements of human skin color, how dark the skin is as a across the planet. And this was measured in the native populations prior to 1940. And we see that, in fact, there is definitely a correlation between darkness of skin and the latitude. And in particular, before there were mass migrations of people over the last 500 years, in fact, most of the dark pigmented people lived within about 20 degrees latitude of the equator, and most of the lighter pigmented people lived outside of that, mostly in the northern hemisphere, north of 20 degrees latitude. Okay, so this is what I'll call the answer to the question of why we have the skin tones that we do. At least this is the prevailing theory that I was able to read about, and it's that we developed evolutionarily to have darker skin when we were going to be living near the equator, when there was too much ultraviolet radiation and that was too dangerous for us. So the melanin helps protect against that. But as we migrated north to areas where there was a lot less UV, then the skin needed to get lighter so that we could have enough UV getting into our skin so that we could make the vitamin D that we need in order to live healthy lives. Okay, turns out there's a lot of other interesting consequences of that we might address another time. But for now, I hope you guys have a sunny week. Bye-bye.